When Eleanor Pemberton shocked San Francisco society by rejecting her wealthy suitor at the city's grandest gala, they whispered she'd lost her mind, but when she disappeared into the night to join a rugged cowboy on a dangerous cattle drive across the untamed frontier, they declared her utterly ruined. Little did they know that in trading her silk gowns for saddle leather and her father's fortune for a love that saw her true worth, Eleanor would discover riches beyond anything her privileged world could offer. But could a sheltered society heiress survive the brutal realities of the 1867 frontier long enough to prove them all wrong? The scream came from the third floor of the Pemberton mansion at exactly 6 in the morning, shattering the peaceful quiet of San Francisco's most expensive neighborhood. Eleanor pressed her face against the cold window glass, watching her mother chase a terrified mouse with a broom while shrieking loud enough to wake every servant in the house. Below in the garden, their gardener, Miguel, looked up with amusement before returning to his roses. Another crisis, Eleanor whispered to herself. But this morning something felt different. The year 1867 had brought changes to their city, and she could feel them stirring in her chest like butterflies trying to escape a jar. Her bedroom door burst open without warning. "Eleanor, come quickly." Her mother, Vivian Pemberton, stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe that cost more than most families earned in a year. Her perfectly arranged blonde hair had come loose from its pins during her battle with the tiny intruder. "What happened, Mother?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Her mother fought the same war with mice every few months, as if the expensive pest control services didn't exist. "That horrible creature ran behind my wardrobe." Vivian's voice rose to a pitch that made Eleanor's ears hurt. "We must call the exterminators immediately. What if it has babies? What if there are dozens of them?" Eleanor sighed and put on her house slippers. Her mother could face down the most powerful business leaders in California during dinner parties, but a mouse smaller than her thumb sent her into complete panic. "I'll ask Miguel to help us move the wardrobe." "Miguel?" Vivian looked shocked. "Absolutely not. What would people think if they knew we allowed the gardener into my private bedroom? The scandal would ruin us." The rules of proper society pressed down on Eleanor like a heavy blanket. Every action had to be measured against what other wealthy families might think. Every conversation had to be planned to avoid giving anyone reason to gossip. Even something as simple as asking their kind gardener for help became a complicated social problem. Eleanor walked to her mother's room, where the massive oak wardrobe stood against the far wall like a wooden fortress. She could hear tiny scratching sounds coming from behind it. The mouse was probably more scared than they were, trapped in a dark space between furniture and wall. "Maybe we could just open the window and guide it outside," Eleanor suggested. "It's not trying to hurt us." "Guide it outside?" Vivian stared at her daughter as if she'd suggested they invite it for tea. "Eleanor, mice carry diseases. They chew through expensive fabrics. They leave droppings everywhere." Eleanor knelt down and peered into the narrow space behind the wardrobe. She could see 2 tiny black eyes looking back at her, filled with fear. The small creature trembled against the wall, probably wondering how it had ended up in this grand house full of giant humans who screamed at the sight of it. "It's just a baby," Eleanor said softly. "Look how small it is." But her mother had already sent a servant running to fetch the pest control man, who would arrive with traps and poison to solve their crisis. Eleanor felt sad watching the frightened animal. In this house, anything that didn't fit perfectly into their organized, expensive world had to be eliminated. The morning routine continued, as it always did. Eleanor returned to her room and began the daily ritual of preparing herself for public appearance. 100 brushstrokes through her long auburn hair, exactly as she'd been taught since childhood. The brush handle felt smooth and familiar in her palm, worn by years of the same repeated motion. Her reflection stared back from the silver-framed mirror, showing a young woman with green eyes and pale skin that never saw too much sunlight. Her face looked pretty enough, she supposed, though she sometimes wondered who she really was, underneath all the careful grooming and expensive clothes. "Eleanor, breakfast is ready," called Mary, one of their house servants. Mary had worked for the Pemberton family for 8 years, ever since she'd arrived from Ireland with nothing but hope and a willingness to work hard. Eleanor often wished she could sit in the kitchen and talk with Mary about her adventures crossing the ocean, but proper young ladies didn't socialize with the help. The dining room sparkled with morning light, streaming through tall windows that faced the bay. Eleanor could see ships moving in and out of the harbor, carrying goods from around the world to San Francisco's busy docks. Some of those ships belonged to her father, making him richer with every cargo delivery. Charles Pemberton sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, reading the morning newspaper while eating eggs prepared exactly the way he liked them. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, his gray beard trimmed to precise angles, and his gold pocket watch gleamed as he checked the time every few minutes. "Good morning, Father," Eleanor said, taking her assigned seat. He looked up briefly, nodded, and returned to his newspaper. The front-page headline talked about railroad construction pushing further west, opening up new territories for business and settlement. Eleanor read the words upside down, fascinated by stories of people building new lives in places where society's rules hadn't been carved in stone yet. "The Morrison shipping contract is coming up for renewal," her father said to her mother, not looking away from his paper. "Their cattle business has been quite profitable lately." Eleanor's ears perked up at the unfamiliar name. Her father rarely discussed business details during meals, considering such topics too complicated for women to understand. But something about the way he said Morrison caught her attention. "Are they a California family?" Vivian asked, cutting her toast into perfect triangles. "No. They work mainly with ranchers from Texas and Kansas. Cowboys and cattle drivers mostly." Charles folded his newspaper with sharp, precise movements. "Not our usual type of clients, but their money spends just as well as anyone else's. Cowboys." Eleanor had read about them in adventure books, but she'd never met anyone who actually worked with cattle or lived on the open range. In her world, meat appeared on plates already cooked and seasoned, with no connection to the animals or people who brought it to their table. "How fascinating," Vivian said in the tone she used when something was actually quite boring to her. Eleanor wanted to ask more questions about the Morrison contract and the cowboys who worked with cattle, but proper young ladies didn't interrupt their father's business discussions. Instead, she ate her breakfast in silence, wondering what it would feel like to work outside under the wide sky instead of sitting in parlors discussing the weather. After breakfast came the morning social obligations. Every Tuesday, Eleanor accompanied her mother on charity visits to distribute food and clothing to the poor families living near the dock. It was considered appropriate for wealthy ladies to perform such acts of kindness, as long as they didn't get too personally involved with the people they helped. The carriage ride to the waterfront took them through several different neighborhoods, each one poorer than the last. Eleanor watched through the window as the grand mansions gave way to smaller houses, then to crowded apartment buildings, and finally to ramshackle shacks where entire families lived in spaces smaller than Eleanor's bedroom. "Remember to keep your gloves on at all times," Vivian instructed as their carriage stopped near the docks. "And don't make eye contact with any rough-looking men. We're here to distribute supplies, not to socialize." Eleanor nodded, though she always felt uncomfortable with these artificial barriers between herself and the people they were supposedly helping. How could she truly understand their needs if she wasn't allowed to actually talk with them? The smell of salt water and fish filled the air as they climbed out of their elegant carriage. The docks bustled with activity, even in the late morning. Sailors loading and unloading cargo, fishermen mending nets, children playing games between the wooden posts that supported the piers. Their driver and a servant began unloading baskets filled with bread, blankets, and other basic necessities. Eleanor carried one of the lighter baskets, careful to maintain her balance on the uneven wooden planks that made up the dock walkways. "Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Eleanor," a voice called out from nearby. Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Catherine O'Brien approaching, with her 3 young children trailing behind her. The O'Brien family had been receiving help from the Pemberton charity efforts for several months, ever since Mr. O'Brien had been injured in a loading accident that left him unable to work. "Good morning, Mrs. O'Brien," Vivian replied politely but coolly. "I trust you're all well?" "Well enough, thanks to your generosity," Catherine said, though Eleanor noticed the tired lines around her eyes and the patches on her children's clothes. "Tommy here just started helping Mr. Santiago with his fishing nets. He's earning a few pennies each day." Tommy, who looked about 12 years old, stood straighter with pride. "I can tie knots as good as anybody, Miss Eleanor," he said directly to her, his eyes bright despite his worn clothes. "That's wonderful, Tommy," Eleanor said, genuinely pleased. She wanted to ask him about the fishing boats and what he'd learned about working on the water, but her mother's sharp look reminded her to keep their interaction brief and formal. As they distributed supplies to other families, Eleanor found herself studying the faces around her. These people worked hard every day, their hands rough from labor, their clothes practical rather than fashionable. Yet many of them seemed to possess something she felt lacking in herself, a sense of purpose, of knowing exactly who they were and what they needed to do to survive. "Miss, are you all right?" A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor looked up to see an elderly man with kind eyes and weathered hands. "You looked a million miles away there." "Oh, I'm fine, thank you," Eleanor replied, realizing she'd been standing motionless while holding a basket of bread. "I was just thinking." "Sometimes thinking's the most important work we can do," the man said with a knowing smile. "Name's Patrick Walsh. Been working these docks for 30 years, and I've learned that the quiet ones usually see the most." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and something else, pleasure at being truly seen by someone. "I'm Eleanor Pemberton." "Ah, Charles Pemberton's daughter. Your father's a fair man in business, pays his bills on time, treats his workers decent enough." Patrick glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Can I give you a piece of advice, Miss Eleanor?" She nodded, curious. "Don't let anyone convince you that thinking is a waste of time. The world needs people who pay attention, who wonder about things, who ask questions, even if they're not the questions everyone expects you to ask." Before Eleanor could respond, her mother appeared at her elbow. "Eleanor, we really must be going. We have the ladies' committee meeting at 2:00. As they walked back to their carriage, Eleanor turned for one last look at the bustling docks. Somewhere in that maze of ships and cargo and hard-working people, life was happening in ways she'd never experienced. Real challenges were being met with real solutions. People made actual choices that mattered to their survival and happiness. The afternoon committee meeting took place in the drawing room of the Weatherby Mansion, where 12 of San Francisco's most prominent ladies gathered to plan the annual charity gala. Eleanor sat in her assigned chair, listening to discussions about flower arrangements and menu selections, but her mind kept drifting back to the docks. "Eleanor, dear, you seem distracted today," said Mrs. Weatherby, a plump woman with sharp eyes who missed nothing that happened in their social circle. "I hope you're not coming down with something. We can't have our young ladies looking peaked during the social season." "I'm perfectly well, thank you," Eleanor replied, forcing herself to focus on the conversation around her. "Speaking of our young ladies," Mrs. Weatherby continued with a meaningful glance at Eleanor's mother, "my Harold has been asking about Eleanor quite frequently lately. Such a fine young man, and so well positioned to take over the textile mills when his father retires." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Harold Weatherby was 26 years old, reasonably handsome, and completely boring. He'd attended the same social functions as Eleanor for years, but she'd never heard him express interest in anything beyond business profits and horse racing. "How lovely," Vivian said with obvious pleasure. Eleanor would be honored by his attention, I'm sure. Would she? Eleanor wondered if anyone had bothered to ask what she might want. Harold was perfectly acceptable according to society standards. Wealthy, well-connected, from a good family. But when she tried to imagine spending the rest of her life listening to him talk about textile production and racehorse breeding, she felt as trapped as the mouse behind her mother's wardrobe. The meeting continued for another hour, covering details that seemed both extremely important and completely meaningless to Eleanor. Which color tablecloths would best complement the ballroom's decor? Should they serve champagne before or during dinner? How many musicians would create the proper atmosphere without overwhelming conversation? As the ladies debated these crucial questions, Eleanor found herself staring out the window at a group of children playing in the street. They'd created some kind of game involving a stick and a ball made of rags, and they were laughing with pure joy as they chased each other around. Their clothes were simple, their toys were homemade, but their happiness seemed genuine in a way that Eleanor rarely felt during her own carefully organized activities. "Eleanor, what do you think?" Mrs. Weatherby's voice cut through her daydreaming. "I'm sorry, what was the question?" Eleanor asked, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "We were discussing the seating arrangements for the gala. Your mother suggested that you be seated next to Harold, which I think is a wonderful idea." Eleanor looked around the room at 12 expectant faces, all waiting for her response. These women had planned her romantic future in the time it took her to watch children play in the street. Her entire life's direction had been decided while she wasn't paying attention. That would be appropriate, Eleanor said carefully, knowing it was the expected response. But as the ladies smiled and nodded their approval, Eleanor felt something rebellious stirring in her chest. The same feeling she'd experienced watching The Frightened Mouse, listening to Tommy O'Brien talk about learning to tie knots, hearing Patrick Walsh encourage her to keep thinking and asking questions. The carriage ride home was quiet, but Eleanor's mind raced with thoughts she'd never dared examine before. What if she didn't want to marry Harold Weatherby? What if she wanted to choose her own husband? Or perhaps not marry at all? What if she wanted to work, to travel, to see what lay beyond the boundaries of San Francisco's rigid social expectations? "You were very well behaved today," her mother said approvingly as they pulled into their circular driveway. "Mrs. Weatherby was quite impressed with your maturity." Maturity. Was that what they called it when a young woman sat quietly while others planned her future? Eleanor wanted to feel proud of earning such praise, but instead she felt hollow, as if part of her was slowly disappearing. That evening at dinner, her father made an announcement that would change everything, though Eleanor didn't know it yet. "I've decided to expand our shipping contracts with the cattle industry," Charles said as the servants cleared their soup bowls. "There's good money to be made transporting supplies to the ranchers and cowboys working the western territories." "How exciting," Vivian replied automatically, though Eleanor could tell her mother found business discussions tedious. "In fact, I'm expecting to meet with several cattle contractors next week. They're passing through the city on their way to Kansas with a large herd. Should be quite profitable for all involved." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Cowboys, coming to San Francisco. People who lived under the open sky, who made their own decisions, who measured success by their courage and skill, rather than by their family connections and bank accounts. "Will they be staying in the city long?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Her father looked at her with mild interest. "A few weeks, I imagine. They need time to gather supplies and rest before the long drive to Kansas." "Why do you ask?" Eleanor felt her mother's warning glance, reminding her that proper young ladies didn't show curiosity about rough men like cowboys. But something inside her refused to be quiet. "I just think it must be interesting," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully, "to meet people who live such different lives from ours." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Business teaches you to work with all kinds of people, Eleanor. Money doesn't care if it comes from cattle or silk or shipping. Profit is profit." But Eleanor wasn't thinking about profit. She was thinking about freedom, about choice, about what it might feel like to wake up each morning not knowing exactly what the day would bring. For the first time in her 22 years, she was wondering if there might be a different way to live. As she went to bed that night, Eleanor pressed her face against her bedroom window and looked out at the city lights twinkling below. Somewhere in San Francisco, cowboys were preparing for a journey that would take them across vast distances to places she'd only read about in books. Tomorrow, her life would continue along its predictable path of social obligations and carefully managed expectations. But tonight, just for a few minutes, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to choose adventure over security, to value courage over comfort, to discover who she might become if she were brave enough to find out. The crash happened so fast that Eleanor barely understood what was occurring until she found herself sitting on the rough wooden planks of the dock. Her carefully arranged skirts twisted around her legs like rope. The basket of charity goods she'd been carrying lay scattered across the pier. Bread loaves rolling toward the water, blankets tangled with fishing nets, and her mother's precious embroidered handkerchiefs fluttering in the morning breeze like escaped butterflies. "Ma'am, I am so very sorry." The voice carried an accent she'd never heard before, not quite southern, but warm and rough like weathered leather. "I was carrying this load of feed sacks and didn't see you coming around the corner." Eleanor looked up through strands of hair that had escaped her usually perfect arrangement. The man standing above her was nothing like anyone in her social circle. His skin was bronzed from working outdoors. His dark hair curled slightly at the edges beneath a well-worn hat, and his clothes spoke of practical work rather than social display. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep brown and genuinely concerned, not calculating her family's wealth or social position. "Please don't apologize," Eleanor said, accepting his offered hand to help her stand. His palm felt rough with calluses, completely different from the soft hands of the wealthy men she knew. I was distracted and not watching where I was going. Still, I should have been more careful, he continued, immediately beginning to gather her scattered charity goods. Eleanor noticed the gentle way he handled each item, as if every breadloaf and blanket mattered. Name's James Morrison, and I sure didn't mean to knock down a lady, especially one doing good works for folks who need help. Eleanor, she replied automatically, then realized she'd given just her first name instead of the formal introduction she'd been taught. Something about this man made her forget the usual social rules. Eleanor Pemberton. James paused in collecting the fallen items, and Eleanor saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Charles Pemberton's daughter? Your father's been doing business with our outfit. Your outfit? Eleanor asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. Morrison Cattle Company. My Uncle Ben started it, but I help run the operations now. We bring herds up from Texas, drive them to Kansas where they get shipped east to the big cities. James handed her the last of the scattered handkerchiefs, and their fingers brushed briefly. Eleanor felt an unexpected spark of warmth from the contact. You're one of the cowboys, Eleanor said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. James smiled, and Eleanor noticed how the expression lit up his entire face. Guilty as charged, though we prefer cattle drivers when we're talking to city folks. Makes us sound more respectable. Are you really driving cattle all the way to Kansas? Eleanor found herself asking questions she'd never thought to voice before. That must be hundreds of miles. More like 1,000, depending on the route we take. Takes about 3 months if the weather cooperates and we don't run into trouble. James adjusted his hat, squinting slightly in the morning sun. It's not easy work, but there's something about being out on the open range that gets into your blood. Eleanor tried to imagine traveling 1,000 miles across unknown territory, sleeping under stars instead of silk canopies, facing whatever challenges arose without servants or social rules to guide every decision. The idea both terrified and thrilled her. It sounds dangerous, she said. Can be. Rivers to cross, storms to weather, sometimes cattle thieves or hostile tribes. But mostly it's just long days in the saddle, and nights around a campfire, watching more stars than you ever knew existed. James looked at Eleanor with genuine interest rather than the polite attention most men gave her. I imagine that's pretty different from life in the fancy houses up on Nob Hill. Eleanor glanced back toward the elegant carriage where her mother waited, probably growing impatient with this extended conversation. Very different, she admitted quietly. Different doesn't always mean better or worse, James said, following her gaze. Just different. A commotion near the main dock interrupted their conversation. Eleanor turned to see a group of rough-looking men gathered around what appeared to be an argument. Voices were raised, and she could see her mother's driver looking nervous as he watched the developing conflict. Trouble? James asked, his relaxed posture immediately becoming more alert. I don't know, Eleanor replied, but she could see her mother frantically waving for her to return to the safety of their carriage. The argument escalated quickly. Eleanor caught fragments of angry words, something about stolen cargo, unpaid debts, and threats of violence. Several of the men had their hands on knife handles or gun belts, and the crowd of dock workers was backing away to avoid getting caught in whatever was about to happen. You should get back to your mother, James said firmly. But before Eleanor could move, the situation exploded into action. One of the angry men shoved another hard enough to send him stumbling backward. The stumbling man crashed into a stack of cargo crates, which toppled over with a tremendous crash. Several loose chickens escaped from their broken crate and began running in all directions, adding chaos to an already dangerous situation. Stop this nonsense right now! James's voice cut through the commotion, with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations. He stepped forward, not aggressively but with confident purpose. Whatever this is about, fighting on the docks isn't going to solve it. Stay out of this, cowboy, snarled one of the angry men, a heavy-set fellow with scars on his knuckles and whiskey on his breath. This ain't your business. Maybe not, but I don't like seeing innocent people get hurt by other folks' problems, James replied calmly. Eleanor watched in fascination as he positioned himself between the angry men and the area where families with children had been receiving charity goods. You threatening us? The scarred man's hand moved closer to his gun, just suggesting that there are better ways to handle disagreements than scaring women and children, James said. His voice remained steady, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he balanced on the balls of his feet, like someone ready to move quickly if necessary. Eleanor held her breath, suddenly realizing that this confrontation could turn deadly in seconds. In her sheltered world, the most serious conflicts involved social snubs or business competition. She'd never witnessed a situation where men might actually hurt each other over their differences. "James Morrison, is that you causing trouble already?" A new voice joined the conversation. Older, gruffer, but with underlying humor. Eleanor turned to see a tall man with gray hair and weathered features approaching the group. "And here I thought you might behave yourself for at least one day in this fancy city." "Uncle Ben," James said, visibly relieving. "Just trying to keep things peaceful." Ben Morrison looked at the angry men with the calm assessment of someone who had handled many difficult situations. "Gentlemen, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about some cargo deliveries. Why don't we step into Murphy's Tavern and discuss this like civilized people? First round of drinks is on me." The magic words, "free drinks," seemed to diffuse the tension immediately. The angry men looked at each other, shrugged, and began walking toward the nearby tavern. The crisis passed as quickly as it had developed, leaving Eleanor amazed at how Ben Morrison had resolved the situation without violence or even raised voices. "Your uncle is very diplomatic," Eleanor said to James as they watched the potential combatants disappear into Murphy's Tavern. "Ben says you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, and more cowboys with whiskey than with fighting," James replied with a grin. "He's been handling difficult people and situations for 40 years. I'm still learning from him." Eleanor found herself studying James with new interest. In the space of a few minutes, she'd watched him show concern for strangers, courage in the face of danger, and respect for his elders' wisdom. The wealthy young men in her social circle talked endlessly about their own importance, but she'd never seen any of them actually step forward to protect others when trouble arose. "Miss Eleanor," her mother's voice carried across the dock with sharp urgency. "Come here, immediately." Eleanor realized she'd been standing close to James during the entire confrontation, close enough to smell the scents of leather and sunshine that clung to his clothes, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Proper young ladies didn't position themselves so near to men they'd just met, especially not rough cowboys who worked with their hands. "I should go," Eleanor said reluctantly. "My mother is worried." "Of course," James said, but he made no immediate move to leave. "Miss Eleanor, would it be forward of me to hope that I might see you again while I'm in the city? Perhaps you visit the docks regularly with your charity work." Eleanor's heart began beating faster. Was this cowboy actually asking to see her again? In her world, such arrangements were made formally through parents and chaperones, with elaborate rules about proper behavior and supervised meetings. Yes, we come here most Tuesday mornings," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out before she could consider their implications. "Then perhaps I'll happen to be working near this area next Tuesday morning," James said with a smile that made Eleanor feel warm and nervous at the same time. "Eleanor Pemberton." Her mother's voice had reached the pitch that meant serious trouble was approaching. "I really must go," Eleanor said, but she found herself reluctant to break the connection with this fascinating stranger who seemed to see her as a real person rather than a social ornament. "Until next Tuesday, then," James said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed both respectful and somehow intimate. Eleanor hurried back to the carriage, her mind spinning with new sensations and thoughts. Her mother's face showed a mixture of concern, embarrassment, and anger that Eleanor recognized as the expression reserved for her daughter's most serious social mistakes. "Eleanor, what were you thinking?" Vivian demanded as soon as the carriage door closed behind them. "Standing there talking to that cowboy person for so long. And during that terrible fight, people were watching." "He was being helpful, Mother. He knocked me down accidentally and was helping gather our charity goods," Eleanor explained, though she knew her mother wasn't really concerned about courtesy or charity. "Helpful or not, you don't engage in extended conversations with strange men, especially not rough-working men like that. What if someone we know had seen you? What if word got back to the Weatherbys?" Eleanor felt the familiar weight of social expectations settling back onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak. For a few minutes on the dock, she'd felt free to be curious, to ask questions, to interact with someone who treated her like an intelligent human being rather than a delicate ornament. Now those constraints were tightening around her again. reminding her of all the things proper young ladies weren't supposed to do. "I'm sorry, Mother," Eleanor said, though she wasn't entirely sure she meant it. "We simply cannot have gossip about you associating with inappropriate people," Vivian continued as their carriage climbed back up the hill toward their elegant neighborhood. "Especially now when the Weatherby family is showing such interest in you." The Weatherbys again. Eleanor was growing tired of hearing about Harold Weatherby and his family's expectations. She'd met Harold at a dozen social functions, and their conversations had never progressed beyond polite exchanges about the weather and his horses. He'd never looked at her the way James Morrison had looked at her, as if her thoughts and opinions might actually matter. "What if I'm not interested in Harold Weatherby?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Her mother stared at her as if she'd announced plans to become a circus performer. "Not interested? Eleanor, he's from one of the finest families in California. His father owns textile mills, his mother is on the board of every important charity in the city, and he's being groomed to take over the family business. What more could you possibly want?" Love, Eleanor thought, but didn't say. Respect. Conversation. Someone who sees me as more than a connection to my father's shipping fortune. "I barely know him, Mother." "You'll get to know him after you're married, dear. That's how these things work. Your father and I barely knew each other when we wed, and we've built a perfectly satisfactory life together." Satisfactory. Eleanor wondered if that was really the best she could hope for from life. A satisfactory arrangement that served everyone's financial and social interests while ignoring her own desires and dreams. The rest of the carriage ride passed in silence, but Eleanor's mind was anything but quiet. She found herself replaying every moment of her encounter with James Morrison, from the initial collision to his brave intervention in the dock-fight, to his request to see her again. No man had ever asked for her time based on genuine interest rather than social obligation or business advantage. Back at the Pemberton mansion, Eleanor went through the motions of her usual afternoon routine. Tea with her mother and two visiting ladies from their social circle, discussion of the upcoming charity gala, an hour of piano practice playing pieces she'd memorized years ago. But part of her attention remained focused on Tuesday morning and the possibility of seeing James Morrison again. That evening at dinner, her father shared more details about his expanding business with the cattle industry. "Met with Ben Morrison today," Charles said between bites of perfectly prepared beef. "Impressive operation they're running. They bring cattle up from Texas ranches, drive them to Kansas railheads, then the trains carry the beef to cities back east. Very profitable, if you can handle the risks involved." "What kinds of risks?" Eleanor asked, remembering James's mention of river crossings and storms. "Weather, mostly. A bad storm can scatter a herd across miles of prairie. Then there are river crossings. Cattle don't swim well, and men have drowned trying to get herds across swollen streams." Charles cut another piece of meat with precise movements. "Thieves are a problem too. Lot of money in a herd of cattle, and not much law enforcement out on the open range." Eleanor thought about James stepping between angry men and potential violence. Are the cowboys, the cattle drivers, are they dangerous men? Her father considered the question seriously. "Some are, I suppose. It's rough work that attracts rough people. But the Morrison outfit seems to hire decent men. Ben Morrison has been in business for 15 years, and you don't last that long if you can't control your crew. I still don't understand why anyone would choose such a difficult life," Vivian said with a delicate shudder. "Living outdoors, sleeping on the ground, eating whatever they can cook over a campfire. It sounds perfectly primitive." "Some men need that kind of freedom," Charles replied thoughtfully. "Can't stand being tied down to the same place, the same routine day after day. They'd rather face uncertain dangers than certain boredom." Eleanor felt something stir in her chest at her father's words. Was it possible that some people actually chose uncertainty over security, that they valued freedom more than comfort? "How strange," Vivian said, clearly unable to imagine such priorities. But Eleanor didn't think it sounded strange at all. It sounded exciting, challenging, real, in a way that her carefully organized life had never felt real. After dinner, Eleanor retired to her bedroom but found herself unable to concentrate on her usual evening activities. She tried reading, but the romantic novels that had once entertained her now seemed shallow and predictable. She attempted needlework, but her hands felt restless, unable to focus on the tiny, precise stitches. Instead, she found herself at her window, looking out over the city toward the bay where ships came and went, carrying people to destinations she could only imagine. Somewhere down at the docks, James Morrison was probably preparing for another day of work, another step in his journey toward the open range and a 1,000-mile cattle drive. Eleanor tried to picture what that life might be like, waking up under a vast sky instead of in a silk-curtained bedroom, facing each day's challenges without knowing exactly what they would bring, measuring success by courage and skill rather than social approval and family connections. The fantasy both thrilled and terrified her. She'd been raised to value security, predictability, the careful management of risk and reputation. The idea of choosing uncertainty, of deliberately stepping into the unknown, went against everything she'd been taught about how proper young ladies should conduct their lives. But as she prepared for bed, brushing her hair with the same 100 strokes she'd performed every night since childhood, Eleanor found herself counting the days until Tuesday morning, until she might see James Morrison again and ask him more about his world of open skies and endless horizons. For the first time in her 22 years, Eleanor Pemberton was looking forward to something that hadn't been planned, arranged, or approved by someone else. The feeling was terrifying and wonderful at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering what it would feel like to fly. Tuesday morning suddenly couldn't come fast enough. "You're glowing," Mary whispered as she helped Eleanor into her simplest dress, a pale blue cotton that wouldn't draw attention at the docks. Like a candle that's been lit from the inside. Eleanor's hands trembled as she fastened her cloak. Tuesday had finally arrived, and she felt as if she were preparing for the most important performance of her life. But this time, she wouldn't be acting the part of a proper society lady. For once, she would simply be herself. "Mary, if anyone asks where I've gone," Eleanor began, then stopped. She couldn't ask their Irish servant to lie for her. It wouldn't be fair to put Mary's job at risk. "I'll say you're visiting the sick children at the orphanage," Mary said with a knowing smile. Which is true enough. Those dock children could use some kindness. Eleanor hugged the older woman impulsively. "Thank you. Just be careful, miss. The world can be hard on young ladies who follow their hearts instead of their heads." The warning followed Eleanor as she slipped out through the kitchen door, avoiding the main entrance where her mother might spot her. The morning fog clung to San Francisco's hills like a gray blanket, muffling sounds and making everything seem mysterious and full of possibility. Her heart pounded as she walked down the steep streets toward the waterfront. What if James Morrison didn't come? What if he'd forgotten their arrangement? What if she was making a terrible mistake that would ruin her reputation forever? But as she rounded the corner near the docks, she saw a familiar figure leaning against a wooden post, scanning the crowd. James straightened when he spotted her, his face breaking into a smile that made Eleanor feel warm despite the cool morning air. "Miss Eleanor," he said, touching his hat brim, "I was hoping you'd come." "I wasn't sure I should," Eleanor admitted, suddenly shy. In daylight, away from the dramatic rescue scene, she wondered what this rough cowboy could possibly find interesting about a sheltered rich girl. "Would you like to see something special?" James asked. "Something you've probably never seen before?" Eleanor nodded, curious despite her nervousness. James led her away from the busy main docks to a quieter area where several large pens had been constructed. Inside the wooden fences, Eleanor saw her first live cattle, enormous brown and white animals with long, sharp horns and gentle eyes. "These are longhorns from Texas," James explained. "We drove them up here for your father's shipping company to transport to buyers back east." Eleanor stared in amazement. She'd eaten beef countless times, but had never connected the elegant meals served in her dining room to these living, breathing creatures. "They're so big," she said softly. "This bull here weighs about 1,500 pounds, James said, pointing to a massive animal that stood calmly chewing grass. "But he's gentle as a lamb if you treat him right. Animals know when you respect them." A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered to stare at the unusual cattle. Eleanor noticed several well-dressed ladies whispering behind their gloved hands, probably shocked to see livestock so close to the civilized parts of the city. "How do you move so many animals such a long distance?" Eleanor asked, genuinely fascinated. "Slowly and carefully," James replied. "Cattle can walk about 15 miles a day if you don't push them too hard. Push them too fast, and they'll stampede or just refuse to move at all." As he spoke, Eleanor noticed how his hands moved to illustrate his words, how his eyes lit up when he talked about something he cared about. She'd never seen such genuine passion in any of the young men from her social circle. James Morrison. A stern voice interrupted their conversation. Eleanor turned to see Ben Morrison approaching, his weathered face showing disapproval. "What are you doing bringing a lady down here to see the cattle?" "Uncle Ben, this is Miss Eleanor Pemberton," James said quickly. "She was curious about our operation." Ben's expression changed immediately when he heard Eleanor's last name. "Charles Pemberton's daughter? Well now, that's different." He touched his hat respectfully. "Pleased to meet you, miss. Your father's been very fair in his business dealings with us." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," Eleanor replied. "I've never seen cattle before. They're quite remarkable." "That they are," Ben agreed, his stern look softening. "Takes special men to handle them too. Not everyone can spend 3 months on the trail, driving ornery beasts across 1,000 miles of prairie." Eleanor glanced at James with new respect. She was beginning to understand that cowboy work required far more skill and courage than she'd imagined. "Miss Pemberton!" A sharp voice cut through the morning air like a knife. Eleanor's blood went cold as she recognized Mrs. Weatherby's tone. "What on earth are you doing here?" Eleanor turned slowly to face the plump woman who held so much power over San Francisco society. Mrs. Weatherby stood with 2 other ladies from their social circle, all 3 looking scandalized to find Eleanor talking to rough working men at the cattle pens. "Good morning, Mrs. Weatherby," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was learning about my father's business interests." "Business interests?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes narrowed as she looked from Eleanor to James and back again. "Young ladies have no need to concern themselves with such matters, especially not in such unsuitable company." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "These gentlemen work with my father. They've been perfectly respectable." "Respectable or not, this is highly inappropriate," Mrs. Weatherby declared. "I'll be speaking to your mother about this immediately." As the 3 society ladies swept away in a rustle of silk and disapproval, Eleanor felt her heart sink. By afternoon, everyone in their social circle would know that Eleanor Pemberton had been caught talking to cowboys at the cattle docks. The scandal would reach her parents within hours. "I'm sorry, Miss Eleanor," James said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for you." "It's not your fault," Eleanor replied, though she could already imagine her mother's reaction to Mrs. Weatherby's report. "I chose to come here." But as she walked back up the hill toward home, Eleanor realized that her secret meetings with James Morrison were over before they'd really begun. Society's watchful eyes were everywhere, and she'd been careless enough to get caught. The afternoon brought exactly the storm Eleanor had expected. Her mother paced the drawing room like a caged animal, her face pale with anger and embarrassment. "How could you do this to our family?" Vivian demanded. "Mrs. Weatherby says you were practically embracing that cowboy person in full view of respectable people." "I was not embracing anyone, Mother," Eleanor said firmly. "I was learning about Father's business." "Business?" Vivian's voice rose to a near shriek. "Young ladies do not conduct business. Young ladies do not associate with rough working men. Young ladies do not shame their families by behaving like common." "Like common? Like common what, Mother?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Like common women who have forgotten their place in society," Vivian finished with icy dignity. "Eleanor, you are confined to the house until further notice. No more charity work. No more social visits. No more anything until you come to your senses." Eleanor felt the walls of her privileged prison closing in around her. "For how long? Until your engagement to Harold Weatherby is announced?" her mother said with finality. "Mrs. Weatherby is willing to overlook this morning's incident if we move forward with the marriage plans immediately." "I never agreed to marry Harold Weatherby," Eleanor protested. "You don't have to agree," Vivian replied coldly. "Your father and I have decided what's best for you. The engagement will be announced at the charity gala this Saturday evening." Eleanor stared at her mother in shock. Saturday was only 4 days away. In 4 days, her life would be decided forever, locked into a path she had never chosen and didn't want. "What if I refuse?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Then you'll be disowned and cast out with nothing," Vivian said without hesitation. "No money, no family, no social position. You'd be completely alone in the world with no way to support yourself. Is that what you want? Eleanor thought about James Morrison and his talk of choosing uncertain dangers over certain boredom, but the reality of being completely alone, without money or family or any way to survive, terrified her more than she wanted to admit. I need time to think, Eleanor said. You have until Saturday, her mother replied. Use the time wisely. That evening, Eleanor sat by her bedroom window, watching the lights of the city twinkle below. Somewhere out there, James Morrison was probably preparing for his journey to Kansas, unaware that their brief friendship had cost Eleanor her freedom. She thought about the cattle they'd shown her that morning, powerful animals who could be led gently but would stampede if pushed too hard. Was that what was happening to her? Had her parents pushed too hard? Too fast? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, Eleanor called, expecting to see Mary with her dinner tray. Instead, her father entered the room. Charles Pemberton looked older than usual, his face lined with worry and something that might have been regret. Eleanor, he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her window. Your mother tells me you've been exploring outside your usual boundaries. Is that what she calls it? Eleanor asked. Charles was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's face in the lamplight. You know, when I was your age, I wanted to be an explorer. I dreamed of sailing to distant lands, discovering new places, having adventures. Eleanor looked at her father in surprise. She'd never heard him talk about dreams or adventures before. What happened to those dreams? She asked. I got married, took over my father's business, became respectable, Charles said with a wry smile. It's what was expected of me, and I convinced myself it was what I wanted too. Do you regret it? Her father considered the question seriously. I've had a good life, Eleanor. Your mother is a fine woman. We've built a successful business, raised a beautiful daughter, but sometimes I wonder who I might have become if I'd been brave enough to choose my own path. Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes. Then why won't you let me choose mine? Because the world is hard on women who step outside society's rules, Charles said gently. Because I'm afraid of what might happen to you if you don't have the protection of a good marriage and a secure position. But what if I don't want protection? Eleanor asked. What if I want to find out what I'm capable of on my own? Charles reached over and took his daughter's hand. Then you're braver than I ever was, he said quietly. But bravery doesn't always keep you safe, Eleanor, and I love you too much to watch you get hurt. After her father left, Eleanor sat in the darkness, torn between understanding his fears and resenting his control. Outside her window, the city hummed with life and possibility, but she felt trapped in a tower of silk and gold, watching the world go by without her. Saturday was coming, and with it, a choice that would determine the rest of her life. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself walking down the aisle toward Harold Weatherby, promising to love and obey a man she barely knew. The image made her feel sick, but the alternative, facing the world alone with no money and no support, seemed equally terrifying. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Pemberton had to decide who she really was and what she was willing to risk to find out. The letter arrived Thursday morning, delivered by a boy who disappeared before Eleanor could ask where it came from. She found it slipped under her bedroom door, written on rough paper in handwriting she didn't recognize. Miss Eleanor, if you want to understand what you're choosing between, meet me at St. Mary's Garden tonight at 9 o'clock. There are things you need to know before Saturday, J.M. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the note. James Morrison was asking her to meet him secretly at night in a place where they definitely shouldn't be seen together. If anyone discovered such a meeting, her reputation would be destroyed completely. But Saturday was only 2 days away. After that, she would belong to Harold Weatherby, and any chance of exploring a different life would be gone forever. Eleanor spent the day pacing her room like a trapped animal, weighing her choices. Her mother had made it clear that any attempt to leave the house would result in immediate consequences. The servants had been instructed to watch her carefully, but as evening approached, Eleanor made her decision. She couldn't marry Harold Weatherby without understanding what she was giving up. She had to know what James Morrison wanted to tell her, even if it meant risking everything. At 8:30, Eleanor wrapped herself in her darkest cloak and slipped out through the same kitchen door she'd used Tuesday morning. Mary was nowhere to be seen, probably deliberately absent to avoid having to report Eleanor's escape. The streets felt different at night. darker, more dangerous, full of shadows and unfamiliar sounds. Eleanor had never been out alone after dark before, and every footstep behind her made her heart race with fear. But she pressed on, driven by a desperate need to understand her choices. St. Mary's Church sat on a quiet side street, its small garden hidden behind high walls covered with climbing roses. Eleanor pushed open the wrought iron gate and stepped into the moonlit space where she and James had talked during those stolen afternoons weeks ago. "I wasn't sure you'd come." James's voice came from the shadows near the old oak tree. Eleanor jumped, then felt relief wash over her. "I almost didn't. This is very risky for both of us." James stepped into the moonlight, and Eleanor could see the serious expression on his face. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something important. Something that might change how you think about your choices." "What is it?" Eleanor asked, moving closer. "Your father's business with our cattle company. There's more to it than just shipping arrangements." James looked uncomfortable, as if he was betraying a confidence. "Ben received a letter from your father yesterday. He's planning to expand into the cattle business himself, but he needs experienced partners." Eleanor frowned, not understanding. "What does that have to do with me?" "Your father offered to invest $50,000 in our operation and to provide shipping services at reduced rates in exchange for a partnership agreement." James paused, studying Eleanor's face in the moonlight. "But there was a condition attached to the offer." "What condition?" Eleanor asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "That I stay away from you permanently. That I leave San Francisco immediately and never contact you again." James's voice was quiet but steady. "Your father is a smart businessman, Eleanor. He knows that removing me from the picture makes your marriage to Harold Weatherby much more likely to succeed." Eleanor felt as if someone had struck her. "He's trying to buy you off?" "Not exactly. He's offering me a genuine business opportunity, one that could make me wealthy and respectable, but the price is giving you up." James stepped closer, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I could take that offer. I could become the kind of man society would consider worthy of you. But," Eleanor sensed there was more, "but it would take years, maybe 5 or 10 years before I'd be established enough to ask for your hand properly. And by then, you'd be married to Harold Weatherby and probably have children." James reached out and took her hands in his. "I can't ask you to wait for a future that might never come." Eleanor felt tears stinging her eyes. "So you're saying goodbye?" "I'm saying that I care about you too much to make this decision for you," James replied. "If you marry Harold Weatherby, you'll have security, comfort, everything society says a woman should want. Your life will be predictable and safe." "And if I don't marry him?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer would terrify her. "Then you'll face the unknown, with no guarantees about what comes next," James said honestly. "I can't promise you wealth or social position or even safety. All I can offer is the chance to discover who you really are when you're free to make your own choices." Eleanor pulled her hands free and walked to the garden's edge, staring out at the city lights through the iron fence. "My parents would disown me if I refused to marry Harold. I'd have no money, no family support, nowhere to go." "You'd have whatever I could provide," James said quietly. "It wouldn't be much at first. A cowboy's wages, a life of hard work and uncertainty. But it would be your choice." "Are you asking me to marry you?" Eleanor asked, turning to face him. James was quiet for a long moment. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to find out what we might become together, if we were both free to choose." Eleanor felt her heart racing. This wasn't the romantic proposal she'd dreamed of as a young girl. There were no guarantees, no promises of happiness, no assurance that love would be enough to overcome the enormous obstacles they would face. "What would happen if I said yes?" she asked. "We'd leave San Francisco together," James said. "Join the cattle drive to Kansas. It would be hard, Eleanor. Harder than anything you've ever experienced. You'd sleep on the ground, eat simple food, work with your hands, face dangers you can't imagine. And after Kansas? We'd build whatever life we could together, maybe stay in Kansas and start a ranch. Maybe go further west to California's Central Valley, where land is cheaper. Maybe something else entirely." James spread his hands. "I can't promise you anything except that we'd face whatever comes as partners." Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to imagine the life James was describing. No silk dresses or fancy meals or elegant parties. No servants or carriages or social position. Just hard work, uncertainty, and the hope that love and courage would be enough. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," James said. "I'm scared that I'm being selfish, asking you to give up everything for a life I can't even properly describe. I'm scared that you'll regret it and hate me for taking you away from everything you've known." "When would we have to leave?" Eleanor asked. "The cattle drive departs Sunday morning at dawn," James said. "If you're going to come with us, you'd have to decide before then." Sunday morning, less than 3 days away. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the impossibility of making such a huge decision so quickly. "James, I need you to understand something," Eleanor said, turning to face him fully. "I've never made a truly important decision in my entire life. My parents have chosen everything for me: where I live, what I wear, who I talk to, where I go. The idea of choosing my own future is terrifying." "I know," James said gently. "That's why I won't pressure you to decide tonight. Take the time you need to think about it. But if I don't give you an answer before Sunday, then I'll know you've chosen the safe path. And I'll respect that choice," James finished. "Eleanor, I won't lie to you. The life I'm offering is hard and uncertain. But it's also real in a way that I don't think you've ever experienced. You'd discover strengths you didn't know you had, face challenges that would change you, become someone new." Eleanor felt something stirring in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced watching the dock workers, listening to Patrick Walsh encourage her thinking, seeing James step between angry men to protect others. It was the desire to matter, to contribute something meaningful, to test herself against real challenges. "What about your uncle's business opportunity with my father?" Eleanor asked. "If I come with you, you'll lose that chance." James shrugged. "There will be other opportunities. But there's only one you, Eleanor." The simple statement hit Eleanor harder than any elaborate declaration of love could have. In her world, women were replaceable, interchangeable ornaments who served similar functions in the social and economic machinery. But James saw her as unique, irreplaceable, worth more than business opportunities or financial gain. "I should go back," Eleanor said reluctantly, "if I'm caught out here." "Of course," James agreed. "But Eleanor, whatever you decide, I want you to know something. These past few weeks, getting to know you, have been the best of my life. You're remarkable in ways I don't think you even realize." Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "No one has ever said anything like that to me before." "Then they weren't paying attention," James said simply. As Eleanor walked back through the dark streets toward her family's mansion, her mind churned with conflicting thoughts and emotions. Everything she'd been taught told her to choose safety, security, the approval of family and society. But something deeper, something she was only beginning to recognize as her true self, yearned for the chance to discover what she was capable of when faced with real challenges. Back in her bedroom, Eleanor sat by the window and stared out at the city where James Morrison was probably lying awake, making his own difficult choices. Tomorrow was Friday. The engagement announcement was scheduled for Saturday evening. The cattle drive would leave Sunday morning. Eleanor had less than 60 hours to decide who she wanted to become. The sheltered society lady who married for security and spent her life in comfortable captivity? Or the unknown woman who might emerge if she had the courage to choose freedom over safety, love over duty, and the terrifying possibility of authentic life over the beautiful illusion she'd always known? For the first time in her 22 years, Eleanor Pemberton held her own future in her hands. The question was whether she would be brave enough to shape it herself, or let others continue to mold it for her. The clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the beginning of Friday. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself in 3 different places: walking down the aisle toward Harold Weatherby, sitting in a comfortable parlor as a respectable married lady, or riding across an endless prairie under a vast sky with James Morrison at her side. Only one of those images made her heart race with excitement instead of dread. But was excitement enough to justify giving up everything she'd ever known? Eleanor fell asleep, still wondering, still choosing, still balanced on the knife's edge between 2 completely different lives. The china teacup shattered against the marble floor with a sound like breaking dreams, sending white fragments across Eleanor's bedroom as her mother stood frozen in the doorway, her face white with shock and rage. "You will not leave this house." Vivian's scream echoed through the mansion as Eleanor continued packing her small travel bag with trembling hands. "I forbid it. Your father forbids it." Eleanor folded her simplest dress, brown wool that would survive the rough conditions James had described, and placed it carefully in the leather satchel Mary had secretly provided. Friday morning had brought her decision with crystal clarity, and no amount of her mother's hysteria would change her mind now. "Eleanor, think about what you're throwing away." Vivian grabbed her daughter's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Eleanor's skin. "The Weatherby family, our social position, your entire future. For what? Some cowboy who will abandon you the moment the novelty wears off?" "You don't know James," Eleanor said quietly, pulling free from her mother's grip. "You've never bothered to know anything about him except that he doesn't meet your standards." "My standards?" Vivian's voice rose to a shriek. "These are society's standards, civilization's standards. You cannot simply run off with some common laborer and expect to survive." Eleanor turned to face her mother fully, and Vivian stepped back at the calm determination in her daughter's green eyes. "Mother, I've spent my entire life being what everyone else wanted me to be. Perfect daughter, perfect society lady, perfect ornament for some man's arm. But I've never been allowed to discover who I actually am. This is who you are." Vivian gestured frantically around the elegant bedroom. "This is your world. These are your people." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "This is the world you chose for me. These are the people you wanted me to become like. But I don't want to spend my life in drawing rooms discussing flower arrangements while the real world happens outside." Footsteps thundered up the stairs, and Charles Pemberton burst into the room, his face dark with anger. "Eleanor, this nonsense stops now. I've had Ben Morrison and his entire crew banned from the docks. If you're thinking of running off with that cowboy, you can forget it." Eleanor's heart sank. "You can't do that. They have contracts, agreements." "I can do whatever I want," Charles said coldly. "I own half the shipping in this city. One word from me, and they'll never work in California again." "Father, please." "No, Eleanor. You've forced my hand." Charles pulled a legal document from his coat pocket. "This is a commitment order. If you continue with this madness, I'll have you declared mentally unstable and confined to an asylum until you come to your senses." Eleanor stared at the official-looking papers in horror. "You would lock me away? To save you from ruining your life?" "Yes." Charles's voice was hard as stone. "I won't watch my daughter destroy herself for some romantic fantasy." The room fell silent, except for Vivian's ragged breathing. Eleanor looked from her father's determined face to her mother's tear-stained cheeks, realizing that her parents' love had become a prison more effective than any asylum could be. "What if I promised to wait?" Eleanor asked desperately. "What if James took your business offer and came back in a few years when he's more established?" "A few years?" Charles laughed bitterly. "Eleanor, that man will be dead within a year. Cattle driving is dangerous work. Men die from stampedes, river crossings, Indian attacks, simple accidents. You think he's some romantic hero, but he's just another rough laborer who won't live to see 30. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're trying to frighten me." "I'm trying to save you," Charles said. "Eleanor, you've lived a sheltered life. You have no idea what real hardship looks like. No idea what it means to go hungry, to sleep in the cold, to face actual danger. This cowboy fascination of yours is based on fairy tales, not reality." Before Eleanor could respond, Mary appeared in the doorway, her Irish accent thick with worry. "Begging your pardon, but there's a gentleman here to see Miss Eleanor. Says it's urgent." "We're not receiving visitors," Vivian snapped. "Ma'am, he says he's from the Morrison Cattle Company. Says there's been trouble at the docks." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "What kind of trouble?" Mary glanced nervously at Charles. "Fighting, miss. The gentleman looks worried sick." Eleanor pushed past her parents and ran down the stairs, her heart hammering with fear. In the main hall, she found Ben Morrison, his hat in his hands, his weathered face grim with bad news. "Miss Eleanor," Ben said, looking uncomfortable in the elegant surroundings. "I'm sorry to bother your family, but James is in jail." "Jail?" Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. What happened? Some of Harold Weatherby's friends came to the docks this morning looking for trouble. Started saying things about you and James, making accusations. Ben's jaw tightened. James tried to walk away, but they pushed him into a fight. When the police came, they arrested James but let the other boys go. Eleanor's parents had followed her downstairs, and she could feel their presence behind her like a storm cloud. Is he hurt? Nothing serious. Black eye, split lip, some bruised ribs. But Miss Eleanor, they're talking about charging him with assault. Could mean months in prison, maybe years. This is perfect, Charles said coldly. Now you can see what kind of man your cowboy really is. A common brawler who can't control his temper. He was defending my honor. Eleanor whirled to face her father. Harold's friends were saying terrible things about me. Then he should have walked away like a gentleman instead of fighting like a street thug, Vivian added. This proves everything we've been trying to tell you. Eleanor felt trapped between her parents' satisfied expressions and Ben Morrison's worried face. This was exactly what they'd wanted. Proof that James was unsuitable, dangerous, beneath her social class. Ben, what can we do? Eleanor asked quietly. Well, miss, James's bail is set at $500. That's more money than our whole crew has put together. Ben twisted his hat nervously. Without him, we can't make the cattle drive. We'll lose everything. $500. Eleanor knew her father kept more than that in his desk drawer for household expenses. It would be nothing to him, but everything to James and his crew. Father, Eleanor said, turning to face Charles with new determination. You could pay James's bail. Why would I do that? Charles asked coldly. Because if you don't, innocent men will lose their livelihoods through no fault of their own. Ben Morrison's crew depends on that cattle drive for their survival. That's not my problem, Charles replied. Perhaps this will teach them to associate with more suitable companions. Eleanor stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. His love for her was real, but it was selfish love. Love that demanded she conform to his vision of what her life should be, regardless of her own desires or dreams. I see, Eleanor said quietly. You're willing to destroy innocent people to control me. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to protect you from making a terrible mistake, Charles said firmly. Eleanor looked around the elegant hallway, at the crystal chandelier, the imported marble floors, the oil paintings of stern ancestors who had built this fortress of wealth and respectability. Everything beautiful, everything perfect, everything designed to keep the messy realities of the outside world at bay. Ben, Eleanor said suddenly, her voice growing stronger, how much money do you need to make the cattle drive without James? Miss Eleanor, we can't leave him in jail. How much? Eleanor repeated. Ben looked confused, but answered, about $300 for supplies and wages. But we really need James to lead. Mother, Eleanor said, turning to Vivian, the sapphire necklace grandmother left me. What's it worth? Vivian's eyes widened in understanding and horror. Eleanor, no. That necklace has been in our family for generations. What's it worth? Eleanor repeated. About $800, Vivian whispered. Eleanor ran upstairs to her jewelry box, ignoring her parents' shouts behind her. The sapphire necklace lay in its velvet case, like captured starlight. Beautiful, valuable, and completely useless for anything except displaying wealth. She grabbed the necklace and ran back downstairs, where her parents stood frozen in shock, and Ben Morrison watched with growing amazement. Ben, take this to the jeweler on Market Street, Eleanor said, pressing the necklace into his weathered hands. Sell it for whatever you can get. Pay James's bail and fund your cattle drive. Miss Eleanor, I can't. Yes, you can, Eleanor said firmly. And tell James that if his offer still stands, I'll meet him at the docks tomorrow morning at dawn. The silence in the hallway was deafening. Eleanor could hear her mother's shocked breathing, her father's furious muttering, the ticking of the grandfather clock that had measured out her imprisoned years. Eleanor, Charles said with deadly quiet, if you walk out that door tomorrow, you are no longer my daughter. No money, no family, no name, nothing. Then I'll discover what I'm worth when I'm not your daughter, Eleanor replied, surprising herself with her calm. I'll find out who Eleanor Morrison might become. Morrison? Vivian gasped. You're taking his name? If he'll have me, Eleanor said, Ben, please tell James I'll be at the docks at sunrise, with whatever I can carry. As Ben Morrison left with the sapphire necklace, Eleanor felt something she'd never experienced before. The terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that she had just chosen her own destiny, regardless of the cost. Her parents stood speechless, watching their perfect daughter transform into a stranger before their eyes. Eleanor looked at them with love and sadness, understanding that this might be the last time they stood together as a family. I hope someday you'll understand, Eleanor said softly. I hope you'll see that choosing courage over comfort doesn't make me crazy or ungrateful. It makes me free. She turned and walked up the stairs to finish packing, leaving her parents alone with their shattered expectations and the echo of dreams they had never bothered to ask if she shared. The first gunshot cracked through the dawn air like breaking thunder, sending Eleanor's heart into her throat as she crouched behind a wooden crate on the dock, still wearing her mother's silk traveling dress that had seemed so practical an hour earlier. "Stay down!" James shouted from somewhere near the cattle pens, his voice carrying authority she'd never heard before. "Ben, get the men to cover!" Eleanor pressed herself lower against the rough wood, trying to understand what was happening. She'd arrived at the docks just as the sun painted the sky pink and gold, expecting to find James and the Morrison crew preparing for their peaceful departure to Kansas. Instead, she'd walked into the middle of a war. Another shot rang out, followed by the angry bellowing of frightened cattle and the shouts of men scrambling for safety. Through gaps in the wooden slats, Eleanor could see figures moving between the shipping containers. Some she recognized as Morrison's cowboys, others wearing the expensive clothes of city men who clearly didn't belong in a dock fight. "This is Sheriff Bradley," a voice boomed across the waterfront. "Everyone put down your weapons and come out with your hands visible." Eleanor's stomach dropped. The sheriff? This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a legal matter that could end with someone dead or in prison. "Miss Eleanor?" She turned to see Cookie, the Morrison crew's cook, crawling toward her hiding spot on his hands and knees. His weathered face was streaked with dirt and worry. "What are you doing here? This ain't no place for a lady." "I came to join the cattle drive," Eleanor whispered back. "What's happening?" "Harold Weatherby and his boys came looking for revenge after James got out of jail," Cookie explained, breathing hard. "Brought some hired guns with them. They want to make sure James never leaves San Francisco." Eleanor felt cold fear settle in her stomach. Harold Weatherby, the man her parents wanted her to marry, was trying to kill the man she loved. The civilized world of social expectations had revealed its brutal core. "Where's James?" Eleanor asked. "Last I saw, he was trying to get the cattle calmed down before they stampede," Cookie said. "Miss Eleanor, you need to get out of here. This is going to get worse before it gets better." But Eleanor shook her head. She'd made her choice to join this dangerous new world, and she wouldn't run at the first sign of real trouble. "How can I help?" Cookie stared at her in amazement. "Help? Miss, this is a gunfight, not a charity tea." "I can't shoot, but I can think," Eleanor said firmly. "There has to be a way to stop this without anyone getting killed." Before Cookie could respond, Eleanor was moving, staying low as she worked her way toward the sound of James's voice. Her silk dress caught on rough wood and metal, tearing in several places, but she pressed on. The elegant fabric that had once symbolized her privileged life now seemed absurdly delicate for this harsh reality. She found James behind the cattle pens, trying to calm a massive longhorn bull that was thrashing against the wooden fence with enough force to break free. If the cattle stampeded in this confined space, people would be trampled to death. "James!" Eleanor called out softly. He spun around, his face showing shock, relief, and terror all at once. "Eleanor, what are you doing here? You need to get to safety." "I came to go with you to Kansas," Eleanor said, crawling to his side. "But right now, I think I can help stop this fight." "Help?" "Eleanor, these men have guns. And my father has influence?" Eleanor interrupted. "James, Harold Weatherby is here because he thinks you've stolen me from him. He's trying to prove he's brave enough to win me back." James looked grim. "So, what do you suggest?" Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing her next words would either save lives or make everything worse. "I'm going to walk out there and tell everyone the truth, that I chose you freely, that no one stole me or forced me into anything." "Absolutely not," James said firmly. "You'll be caught in the crossfire." "Not if I'm talking to them," Eleanor replied. "James, These aren't criminals or outlaws. They're businessmen and society boys who got in over their heads. They'll listen to a lady, especially one they think they're fighting over." Another shot rang out, closer this time, and the longhorn bull gave a mighty bellow that shook the wooden fence posts. Eleanor could see other cattle beginning to panic, their eyes rolling white with fear. "Eleanor, I can't let you risk yourself for me," James said desperately. "You're not letting me do anything," Eleanor replied, standing up despite his attempts to pull her back down. "I'm choosing to do this because it's the right thing to do." She smoothed her torn silk dress as best she could and walked out from behind the cattle pens with her head held high, moving toward the center of the conflict with the grace she'd been taught in countless etiquette lessons. "Harold Weatherby," she called out in her clearest voice, "this fighting stops now." The shooting ceased immediately. Eleanor could see figures emerging from behind various pieces of cover. Harold and 3 of his friends on one side, Ben Morrison and his cowboys on the other, all staring at her in amazement. "Eleanor?" Harold's voice carried across the dock, uncertain and confused. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to tell you that this fight is pointless," Eleanor said, walking slowly toward the center of the space between the two groups. "No one has stolen me, Harold. No one has forced me into anything. I made my own choice." "Your choice?" Harold stepped out from behind a shipping container, his expensive clothes torn and dirty, his usually perfect hair disheveled. "Eleanor, you can't possibly understand what you're saying. This cowboy has filled your head with romantic nonsense. James Morrison has shown me respect, Harold. He's listened to my thoughts, valued my opinions, treated me like an intelligent human being instead of a decorative object." Eleanor's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Can you say you've ever done the same?" Harold's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "I've treated you like a lady. I've been a perfect gentleman." "You've been perfectly polite," Eleanor agreed, "but you've never once asked me what I wanted from life, what I dreamed about, what I hoped for. You saw my father's money and my social position, not me." "Because that's what matters," Harold shouted. "Eleanor, you're talking about throwing away everything that makes you valuable." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm talking about discovering what makes me valuable when I'm not attached to my father's fortune." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun but not drawing it. "Miss Pemberton, are you here of your own free will?" "Completely," Eleanor replied. "Sheriff, I've come to join the Morrison cattle drive to Kansas. No one has coerced me or threatened me. This is my free choice as an adult woman." "She's not thinking clearly," Harold protested. "She's been bewitched by this cowboy's lies." "What lies would those be, Harold?" Eleanor asked calmly. "That hard work has dignity? That courage matters more than comfort? That a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account?" James stepped out from behind the cattle pens, moving slowly with his hands visible to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "Sheriff, we don't want any trouble. We just want to leave peacefully with our cattle and continue our business." "And take her with you?" Sheriff Bradley gestured toward Eleanor. "Only if she chooses to come," James said firmly. "I've never asked Miss Eleanor to give up anything she wasn't willing to sacrifice freely." Eleanor looked around at the faces watching her. Harold's friends shocked and disapproving. The Morrison cowboys respectful but worried. The sheriff trying to determine if any laws were being broken. These men were deciding her fate based on their own ideas about what women should and shouldn't be allowed to do. "Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger, "I'm 22 years old. I'm unmarried, and not under any legal guardianship. Don't I have the right to choose my own companions and my own destination?" Sheriff Bradley considered this carefully. "Legally, yes, miss, but this is highly unusual." "Unusual doesn't mean illegal," Eleanor pointed out. "Sheriff, I'm asking you to ensure my right to leave San Francisco freely, without harassment or threats." The sheriff looked from Eleanor to Harold to James, clearly wishing he was dealing with something simpler like robbery or public drunkenness. "Mr. Weatherby, do you have any legal claim on Miss Pemberton?" "We're engaged," Harold protested. "No, we're not," Eleanor said calmly. "My parents may have discussed marriage arrangements with your parents, but I never agreed to any engagement." "Miss Pemberton," Sheriff Bradley said formally, "are you certain you want to leave with these men? Once you go, there may be no coming back." Eleanor looked at James, seeing the love and worry in his brown eyes, the way he stood ready to protect her but wouldn't pressure her to choose him. She thought about her parents, probably sitting in their elegant dining room wondering if their daughter had completely lost her mind. She thought about the comfortable life she was abandoning and the uncertain future she was embracing. "Sheriff, I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Eleanor said. "I'm choosing courage over comfort, love over duty, and the chance to discover who I really am over the safety of remaining who others expect me to be." Harold made one last desperate attempt. "Eleanor, if you leave with him, you'll be ruined. No respectable family will ever accept you back." Eleanor smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "Then I'll discover what it means to be acceptable to myself instead of to society." She turned and walked toward James, each step taking her further from the world she'd known and closer to the unknown future they would face together. Behind her, she could hear Harold's angry protests and the sheriff's firm instructions for everyone to disperse peacefully. James met her halfway, his eyes shining with admiration and love. "Eleanor Morrison," he said softly, "are you ready to find out what we're capable of together?" "Ready," Eleanor replied, taking his offered hand as the morning sun climbed higher over San Francisco Bay, lighting their path toward the vast, challenging, beautiful unknown that awaited them on the trail to Kansas. The lightning split the black sky like a giant's whip, illuminating Eleanor's terrified face as she clung to her horse while 2,000 panicked cattle thundered past her in the darkness, their hooves shaking the earth like an earthquake that wouldn't stop. "Hold on!" James's voice barely reached her over the deafening roar of the stampede. "Don't let go of the reins." Eleanor's hands burned from gripping the leather straps so tightly, her whole body aching from 3 weeks on the trail that had transformed her from a sheltered society lady into something she barely recognized. Her once soft palms were now cracked and bleeding, her face bronzed by sun and wind, her expensive riding dress replaced by practical men's clothing that Cookie had found for her in a trading post. Another flash of lightning revealed the chaos around them. Cowboys racing alongside the stampeding herd, trying to turn the lead animals before they scattered across miles of Nebraska prairie. Eleanor could see Ben Morrison riding hard to her left, his weathered face grim with concentration as he worked to control his frightened horse. "Eleanor!" James appeared beside her, his own mount dancing nervously as thunder crashed overhead. "We need to get you to safety." "No," Eleanor shouted back, surprising herself with her determination. "I can help. Tell me what to do." James stared at her for a moment, rain streaming down his face. 3 weeks ago, she would have fainted at the first sign of danger. Now she was demanding to join the fight against nature itself. "Stay behind me," he called. "We're going to try to turn the leaders. If your horse goes down, roll away from the hooves and crawl to that rocky outcrop." Eleanor nodded, her heart hammering with fear and excitement. This was nothing like the gentle horseback rides in Golden Gate Park. This was real danger, real challenge, real life happening at breakneck speed under an angry sky. They rode hard into the storm, Eleanor following James's lead as he worked to get ahead of the stampeding cattle. The animals' eyes rolled white with terror, their long horns catching the lightning flashes like deadly spears. One stumble, one wrong move, and both horse and rider would be trampled to death. But Eleanor didn't think about the danger. For the first time in her life, she felt completely alive, every sense focused on the immediate challenge of survival. The rain stung her face, the wind whipped her hair, and her muscles burned with effort, but she had never felt more real than in this moment of pure, desperate action. "There," James pointed toward the front of the herd. "See that big black bull? He's leading them. If we can turn him, the others will follow." Eleanor squinted through the rain and darkness, spotting the massive animal James meant. The bull was running with single-minded determination, his powerful body cutting through the storm like a living battering ram. Working together, Eleanor and James rode alongside the stampeding herd, gradually moving closer to the lead bull. Other cowboys appeared out of the storm. Ben Morrison Cookie, a young man named Tom, who had befriended Eleanor during the journey. They worked as a team, each rider knowing exactly what the others would do. Eleanor watched in fascination as James began the delicate process of turning the herd. Too much pressure, and the cattle would scatter in all directions. Too little, and they would continue their dangerous stampede until they ran themselves to death or crashed into obstacles that would kill dozens of animals. "Now!" James shouted, and suddenly Eleanor found herself riding straight at the lead bull, waving her hat and shouting at the top of her lungs. The massive animal's head swung toward her, his eyes reflecting the lightning like angry red coals. For a terrifying moment, Eleanor thought he would charge directly at her. Then, slowly, his direction began to change. Other cattle followed, the entire herd gradually curving away from its straight-line stampede. The turn took nearly an hour to complete, but finally the cattle slowed to a nervous walk, then stopped altogether in a natural valley that provided some shelter from the storm. Eleanor sat on her exhausted horse, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking from adrenaline and exertion. "You did it," James said, riding up beside her with amazement in his voice. "Eleanor, you actually helped turn a stampede. Most experienced cowboys never get a chance to do what you just did." Eleanor looked around at the other riders, seeing new respect in their eyes. 3 weeks ago, they had viewed her as a burden, a rich girl playing at adventure who would slow them down and cause problems. Now she had proven herself under the most dangerous conditions possible. "How do you feel?" Ben Morrison asked, his gruff voice gentler than usual. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Her body hurt in places she didn't know could hurt. Her clothes were soaked and muddy, her hair tangled with burrs and dirt. She was exhausted, hungry, and probably looked terrible. "I feel," Eleanor paused, searching for the right word. "I feel like myself. For the first time in my life, I feel like myself." The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the prairie washed clean under emerging stars. The cowboys made camp in the shelter of some rocks, building a fire to dry their clothes and warm coffee to restore their spirits. Eleanor sat beside the fire, watching James tend to a cut on his horse's leg with gentle, skilled hands. She thought about Harold Weatherby and his friends, probably sitting in a comfortable San Francisco club right now, complaining about business problems that seemed laughably small compared to what she had just experienced. "Penny for your thoughts," Cookie said, settling down beside her with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "I was thinking about the people I left behind," Eleanor admitted, wondering if they could ever understand what tonight was like. "Probably not," Cookie said honestly. "Most folks spend their whole lives avoiding the kind of challenge you just faced. They choose safety over adventure, comfort over growth." "Do you think I made the right choice?" Eleanor asked quietly. Cookie looked at her with eyes that had seen 40 years of hard living. "Miss Eleanor, 3 weeks ago you were a scared city girl who'd never spent a night outdoors. Tonight you helped save a whole herd of cattle in the middle of a thunderstorm. You tell me, did you make the right choice?" Eleanor smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Yes. Even if it kills me, yes." "It won't kill you," James said, joining them at the fire. "You're tougher than you know, Eleanor Morrison." The casual use of her new name, Eleanor Morrison, and sent a thrill through her that was better than any praise she'd received in San Francisco's drawing rooms. She wasn't Charles Pemberton's daughter anymore, or Harold Weatherby's intended bride. She was Eleanor Morrison, cattle driver, storm rider, woman who had faced down a stampede and lived to tell about it. "James," Eleanor said suddenly, "I want to learn everything. How to rope cattle, how to read weather signs, how to cook over an open fire, how to survive out here without depending on anyone else to take care of me." James smiled, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "It won't be easy. This life demands everything you've got, and then asks for more." "Good," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm tired of easy. I want to find out what I'm really capable of when the stakes matter." Ben Morrison listened to this exchange with growing amazement. He had seen many people try to adapt to frontier life, and most of them broke under the pressure within days or weeks. But Eleanor Pemberton, Eleanor Morrison, was growing stronger with each challenge. "You know," Ben said thoughtfully, "when we get to Kansas, we're going to need people to help start the ranch. People who understand cattle, who can handle themselves in difficult situations." "Are you offering me a job?" Eleanor asked with a grin. "I'm offering you a partnership," Ben replied seriously. "Equal shares, equal work, equal say in how we build this operation." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. In her old life, women weren't offered partnerships in anything. They were decorative additions to men's achievements, never full participants in building something meaningful. "I accept," Eleanor said without hesitation. As the fire burned lower and the cowboys settled down to sleep under the vast star-filled sky, Eleanor lay beside James, listening to the sounds of the prairie night. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled their wild songs. The cattle lowed softly as they settled for rest. The wind whispered through the grass with voices older than civilization. "Any regrets?" James asked quietly. Eleanor thought about her parents, probably lying awake in their silk-sheeted bed, wondering if their daughter was still alive. She thought about the comfortable future she had abandoned, the security she had traded for uncertainty. "Only that I waited so long to discover who I really was," Eleanor whispered back. The storm had washed more than just the prairie clean. It had washed away the last traces of the frightened, constrained woman Eleanor used to be, revealing someone stronger, braver, and more capable than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her growing strength and skill. But tonight, under the endless western sky, Eleanor Morrison fell asleep, knowing that she had finally found her true home. Not in any building or city, but in the courage to face whatever came next with the man she loved and the work that gave her life meaning. The society ladies of San Francisco could keep their drawing rooms and charity committees. Eleanor had found something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that she could survive and thrive in a world that demanded everything she had to give, and somehow always found more strength than she knew she possessed. The town of Dodge City rose from the Kansas prairie like a mirage of civilization, its wooden buildings and dusty streets marking the end of their 3-month journey across 1,000 miles of wilderness that had transformed Eleanor from a sheltered heiress into a woman she barely recognized. "There it is," James said, riding up beside Eleanor as she sat tall in her saddle, her once soft hands now calloused and sure on the reins. The end of the trail. Eleanor studied the bustling frontier town spread out before them, watching the cattle cars being loaded at the railroad depot, hearing the sounds of commerce and celebration that marked successful drives reaching their destination. But instead of relief, she felt something unexpected: sadness that this incredible journey was ending. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. Though she wasn't entirely sure, she wanted to know the answer. "Now we sell the cattle, pay the crew, and decide what comes next," Ben Morrison replied, joining them on a small ridge overlooking the town. "Eleanor, you've earned a full share of the profits. Should be enough to buy land and start your own operation, if that's what you want." The idea of owning land, of building something permanent with her own hands and decisions, thrilled Eleanor in ways that inheriting her father's shipping fortune never had. But first, there was business to conclude, and a more immediate concern weighing on her mind. "Ben, before we celebrate anything, I need to know, has word reached Dodge City about what happened in San Francisco? About me?" Ben's weathered face grew serious. "Eleanor, I won't lie to you. Your story has spread pretty far. Running off with a cattle drive, abandoning your family and social position, it's the kind of tale that grows in the telling." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of reception can I expect?" "Mixed," Ben said honestly. "Some folks will see you as a scandalous woman who brought shame on her family. Others will see you as someone brave enough to choose your own path. Either way, you're famous now." James reached over and took Eleanor's hand. "We can go somewhere else. Start fresh where nobody knows our story." "No," Eleanor said firmly, surprising both men with her determination. "I'm not going to spend my life running from the choices I've made. If I'm famous for choosing love over duty and courage over comfort, then I'll live with that reputation." As they rode into Dodge City with the herd, Eleanor noticed the stares and whispers that followed them down the main street. Some looks were disapproving, others curious, and a few openly admiring. Word of the society lady turned cowgirl had indeed preceded them. The cattle pens near the railroad were a chaos of activity. Buyers examining herds, cowboys celebrating successful drives, businessmen negotiating deals that would send Kansas beef to dinner tables in Chicago and New York. Eleanor had never seen anything like the organized confusion of a major cattle market. "Miss Eleanor Morrison?" a voice called out from the crowd. Eleanor turned to see a well-dressed woman approaching, flanked by 2 other ladies who looked like they'd stepped out of a Harper's Bazaar fashion plate. "Yes," Eleanor replied cautiously. "I'm Martha Davidson, president of the Dodge City Ladies Improvement Society. We've heard about your journey, and we'd like to speak with you." Eleanor's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. The proper ladies of Dodge City were going to tell her she wasn't welcome in their respectable community. Mrs. Davidson, Eleanor said politely, I understand if my presence here is concerning to you. Concerning? Martha Davidson laughed, a rich, genuine sound that surprised Eleanor. My dear girl, you're the most exciting thing to happen to this town in years. We'd like to invite you to speak at our next meeting about women's opportunities in the frontier territories. Eleanor stared in amazement. You want me to speak? About opportunities for women? Absolutely. You've proven that women can do far more than society typically allows. There are ladies here who dream of starting their own businesses, buying their own land, making their own decisions about their futures. You're living proof that such dreams are possible. James stepped closer to Eleanor, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the assembled ladies. Mrs. Davidson, Eleanor's been through a lot. She might need time to adjust before taking on public speaking. Oh, Mr. Morrison, Martha said with a knowing smile. I think you'll find that your wife is quite capable of making her own decisions about what she's ready to handle. Wife. The word hung in the air between them, like a question that hadn't been properly answered. Eleanor and James had been through everything together. Danger, hardship, triumph. But they had never actually formalized their relationship with legal vows. Actually, Eleanor said, looking at James with sudden clarity, we're not married yet. We've been partners during the drive. The admission created a ripple of shocked whispers among the gathered crowd. Even in the relatively free-thinking frontier town of Dodge City, unmarried couples traveling together was scandalous. Well then, Martha Davidson said briskly, that's easily remedied. Judge Henderson performs marriages every Saturday evening after the weekly dance. If you'd like, we could arrange a proper frontier wedding. Nothing fancy, but legal and witnessed by the community. Eleanor felt her heart racing. Marriage to James had always been her assumption, but somehow the actual decision had never been formally made. They had been so focused on survival and reaching Kansas that the future had remained comfortably vague. James, Eleanor said softly, is that what you want? To make this official? James looked at the woman beside him. No longer the pampered society lady he'd met on the San Francisco docks, but a strong, capable partner who had proven herself under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Eleanor Morrison, James said formally, loud enough for the crowd to hear, you've already proven you're brave enough to face anything life throws at us. Will you marry me and make our partnership permanent? Eleanor thought about the woman she used to be, sitting in her father's mansion, waiting for others to decide her future. Then she looked at the man who had shown her what she was capable of becoming, and at the frontier town that represented endless possibilities for people brave enough to seize them. Yes, Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying across the busy cattle pens. James Morrison, I will marry you, because you taught me that the best partnerships are built on respect, shared challenges, and the courage to face the unknown together. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Cowboys threw their hats in the air. Ladies clapped their gloved hands, and someone started playing a fiddle that had appeared from nowhere. Saturday evening it is, Martha Davidson announced. Ladies, we have a wedding to plan. As the celebration swirled around them, Eleanor and James found themselves swept into the warm embrace of a community that valued courage and determination over social pedigree and family connections. That evening, as they sat around a campfire on the outskirts of town, sharing the last night of their great journey, Eleanor reflected on everything that had brought them to this moment. Do you think my parents will ever forgive me? Eleanor asked quietly. I think they'll come to understand that you chose happiness over security, James replied. And maybe someday they'll be proud that they raised a daughter brave enough to follow her heart. Eleanor reached into her travel pack and pulled out a letter she had been writing during the long evenings on the trail. Page after page of descriptions about prairie, sunsets, stampedes, river crossings, and the daily challenges that had revealed her true strength. I'm going to send this to them, Eleanor said, not to ask for forgiveness, but to help them understand who I've become. And who have you become? James asked gently. Eleanor looked around at the endless prairie stretching beyond their firelight, at the stars that had guided them across a continent, at the man who had believed in her potential when she didn't even know it existed. I've become Eleanor Morrison, she said with quiet confidence. Cattle driver, prairie survivor, partner in the Morrison Ranch, and soon-to-be wife of the man who taught me that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the courage to choose your own path and the love of someone who values your authentic self. The society ladies of San Francisco had laughed when she married the cowboy, thinking she was throwing her life away for romantic nonsense. But sitting under the vast Kansas sky, surrounded by the results of her own hard work and determination, Eleanor knew she had found something infinitely more valuable than social position or inherited wealth. She had found herself, and on Saturday evening, in a simple frontier ceremony witnessed by cowboys and townspeople who measured worth by character rather than bank accounts, Eleanor Pemberton would become Eleanor Morrison permanently, sealing her transformation from sheltered heiress to frontier woman, with vows that promised not comfort and security, but partnership in whatever adventures life might bring. The laughter that had followed her from San Francisco's ballrooms had been replaced by the respect of people who understood that true courage meant choosing the unknown over the comfortable, love over duty, and the challenging path of self-discovery over the easy road of others' expectations.